Today in this video, I would love to take a look and summarize at how we can simplify and therefore improve our sewing at no additional cost without learning anything new. The only investment here is really just your time and your thoughts. Hello my dear sewing friends, it's Alisa here, and as always I'm talking from my own personal experiences, so it doesn't always apply to everybody, but I don't think I'll be wrong to say that we probably all believe that the more choices we have, the more freedom we have, and in some cases that is very, very true. But when we're talking in the context of sewing, I've actually observed something completely different. I've noticed that with a lot of options to choose from, for me, it actually becomes more difficult to make a choice at all, especially when the choices and options that I have are the wrong kind of options. So for example, fabric that I have in my fabric stash that I no longer love and I don't really want to wear it, or supplies that I've never used and I'm never going to use, or a tool or a gadget that you kind of bought on the whim. You don't really know why you bought it, but you have it. Perhaps you don't even know how to use it, but all of that creates a lot of options and a lot of choices and a lot of overwhelm. So if you ever felt lost walking into your sewing space or looking at your supplies, and if you ever felt pushed down instead of feeling uplifted and enthusiastic, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You know that quote when people say, I have a full closet of clothes but absolutely nothing to wear? It's sort of like the same situation over here, and I truly, truly believe that by simplifying some of your sewing, you can actually really improve it, and beyond that, you can bring that creativity back into your life. One of the ways to really simplify and therefore improve your sewing is by paring down all of those choices. In other words, to declutter your sewing supplies. And as you know, I do this every year, and here's a list of the supplies that I look at during this process, starting with the fabric. Fabric is the most wonderful, but the most painful at the same time. It is a big task to go through all of your fabric, but it's wonderful in the way that if you have a lot of fabric that you have fallen out of love with, you no longer see yourself using it ever again, then you can move that fabric out of your sewing area and create a lot of extra space, because fabric does take a lot to be stored. Then if it's still in great condition, you can sell it, you can donate that, you can take it to your local school or creativity camp, and you can share that fabric with others who can actually use it. But it's the most painful one, because it is very, very painful to part with that fabric that we once bought with a lot of ideas and a lot of hopes and a lot of creative thoughts. Yes, it's a really big challenge, but once you start going through that, it becomes easier and easier with every decision that you make. Once you are left only with the fabric that you enjoy and love sewing with, I promise you it's going to be much easier to move on to your next creative project. But don't forget things like, for example, lining or other miscellaneous fabric pieces that we don't necessarily like. I mean, who likes lining, but they're necessary for our project. So definitely keep that in mind when you're going through all of your fabric pieces. And just for the record, I'm not saying that you should absolutely get rid of everything and be bare bones in your sewing supplies. Not at all. In fact, everybody is very, very different. So as always, you have to do what is right for you. But I do think from my observations that that happy middle, that moderate amount is probably where creativity thrives for the most of us. When you have not too little, not too many, but just the right amount of choices for your creative style. So that way you can really thrive instead of being bogged down. Next, take a look through your sewing patterns, because they also take a ton of space and they create a lot of different choices and options, and it can be very frustrating if half of the patterns are not your size, half of the patterns you don't really like, and whatnot. Now, I can tell you that I don't use commercial patterns because I draft my own, but I did have a stack of commercial patterns that came together with sewing magazines, which is my guilty pleasure. Sewing magazines and sewing books, I really love those. And I go through them from time to time, but I've never even touched those sewing patterns, so I was happy to let them go. Now, I can share with you how I pared down some of my self-drafted patterns. I went through my binder and I took a look at any of the patterns that I drafted that are nearly identical. Usually that happens when I have a tutorial or a video where I have to repeat the drafting process, and after that I just file the pattern away. But in reality, I don't need 3 drop shoulder tops that are nearly the same. So I just went through, pared it down, so that way instead of being this thick, my binder is now this thick, and it's a lot more manageable. Another big category to look at are all of the other sewing supplies that does not include fabric or sewing patterns. So for example, thread, zippers, buttons, interfacing, any sort of elastics or anything like that that you might have accumulated a large amount but you no longer use. Go through that and you will be surprised how many things you can give to others or perhaps sell that really frees up this space, not only physically but also mentally. In short, I do believe that the easier and simpler it is for you to get started with a project and stay on that project, the more time you will actually have to improve your sewing skills. And that's why I think that simplifying does lead to the improvement. Next way to simplify your sewing is to actually organize. The only thing is that I wouldn't start organizing before decluttering, because if you do have a lot of extra stuff that you no longer like and you no longer use, then by organizing first, you're just going to be shuffling it around. I think it's a lot easier to declutter first and then move on to organizing stage. Here I do kind of follow the same structure. I start with the fabric because that is one of the main supplies that we use when it comes to sewing, and that's probably the biggest supply that we have because, as I mentioned, it does take a lot of space. So start by organizing fabric. For me, it was separating fabric in different groups and placing like with like items together so that way it's easier to find. So a good example is I sew for my child, therefore I do have fabrics with kids prints on them. So instead of having kids prints all over, I just made sure that they all fit in one big tub. I've definitely been in a situation when I had that creative idea. I knew exactly what I wanted to make. I knew which fabric I'm going to choose for my fabric stash. All I had to do is go and find it. But it took me like 20 minutes to find it because I thought it was in one spot, but it turns out it was in the other spot. And by the time you find it, if you only had an hour that you could spare and you spend 20 minutes out of that time looking for the supplies, well, you might as well just not even start, right? Because a third of that time you already wasted. So in order to avoid that, organizing your supplies and kind of keeping the control of what is where and having easy access to that is definitely going to help. After I organized all of the fabric, I also went ahead and organized all of my self-drafted patterns, and after that, all of those other sewing supplies that we use on a regular basis. Now, decluttering and organizing for some sounds like a really fun idea and thing to do, but for most it probably seems like a very mundane task and you would rather be sewing than doing that. But you don't need to do that often. Like I said, in my case, I do it once a year, but it does make a huge difference, and then the rest of the year you're setting yourself up for success. Another thing worth looking at in order to simplify your sewing and just kind of get a fresh start is to take a look at your box of unfinished projects if you have some. I usually don't have that many, but the ones that I do are definitely sitting right there in the corner, nagging at me anytime I'm about to start a new project. So they're definitely living rent-free in my mind. And once I am done with that box, it feels a lot lighter. And a lot of times when you do have a project that you've been working on for a really long time and it's just not turning out and you're not sure what else to do with it in order to save it somehow, if you just let that project go, if you know that there's absolutely no way to do anything else with it, maybe just cutting it up for scraps or doing something else with it so that way you can just let it go and move on. Now, as I mentioned, all of this will set you up for success, and I truly believe in that, speaking from my personal experience. But all it requires is just a little bit of your time and a little bit of your thought. And if you're ready to do a little bit more about that, I have a full series that I did this year, starting with a huge sewing room declutter. So definitely click right over here so that way we can do it together and have a brighter, more creative year of sewing. Until next time, happy sewing, and I'll see you very soon in another video. Bye!